Now let's turn to more important developments in Belarus. We now have a clearer idea of what's happened to one of the country's main opposition leaders, Ms Kolesnikova. She was last seen in Minsk being bundled into a van by masked men on Monday. We now have this footage released by the Belarusian border guards, which they say shows 3 opposition leaders, including Ms Kolesnikova, at the border with Ukraine. And we also have this account from Ukraine's Deputy Interior Minister.
Yesterday in Minsk, 3 members of the Opposition Coordination Council, including Ms Kolesnikova, were kidnapped by men in plain clothes, allegedly special service officers of Belarus State Security Committee. Afterwards, those citizens were driven to the border with Ukraine, where their forcible expulsion from Belarusian territory was planned with an intention to use this fact as if opposition leaders betrayed hundreds of thousands of their followers and stopped fighting against the Lukashenko regime.
Well, in the last few hours, those 2 members of the Opposition Coordination Council have been giving a press conference, and the BBC's Jonah was there. He's been speaking with one of them, Kravtsov, who was with Ms Kolesnikova at the border.
At that moment, Maria was forcefully put in the car. She literally tore her passport into small pieces.
So as they were giving her back her passport for her to travel in Ukraine?
Yeah, exactly. It was lying in the car, and she took it immediately and tore it up. Then she climbed out the car through the rear window because the doors were blocked, and she walked proudly to the Belarusian territory.
So this was in no man's land?
Yeah, this was in no man's land, and I think it's heroic. It's really fantastic what she did.
So she was very clear with them that she did not want to be forced into Ukraine?
Absolutely. I think if one tears his passport up, so he might want to seem absolutely clear with that, yeah.
And do we know where Ms Kolesnikova is now?
Yeah, this is a big problem we're talking about, because when she's detained, we even don't know where exactly she is, because I think on the 7th of September she was in KGB, but now we really but we don't know where she's now, and this is a real problem.
Extraordinary story. Now, the other important development coming from Belarus concerns the president, Alexander Lukashenko. He said he won't step down despite the weeks of protest. Now, that bit we could have predicted, but according to Russian media, he hasn't ruled out an early election. Here's more from him. He says, "I won't leave just like that. I've been developing Belarus for a quarter of a century. I'm not going to simply throw all that away. What's more, if I go, my supporters will be slaughtered," he says. And he also had this warning for Russia.
You know what we concluded with the Russian establishment and leadership. If Belarus falls, Russia will be next.
Well, the UN Special Rapporteur on Belarus has had comments on this. She says there are alarming signs that Mr. Lukashenko's administration was becoming increasingly unhinged as it tries to fend off these protests.
There has never really been any respect for rule of law in Belarus. But what we have been witnessing for the past 4 weeks is more like lawlessness, a sense of anarchy when a state tries to expel its own citizen. It's just not acceptable from the perspective of international human rights law.
Also, the main opposition presidential candidate has been speaking again today. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was forced to flee after she complained that the election was rigged, and she's been calling for sanctions against Mr. Lukashenko's government.
Hundreds of people are jailed, beaten, raped. This should not be the norm in Europe. This can't be the norm in a civilized world.
But the power of sanctions would appear limited. Mr. Lukashenko has been in power since the 90s, and only one of 2 things would appear to be able to change that: the police and army in Belarus turning against him, or Vladimir Putin deciding he needs to go. And at the moment, despite all these huge protests, those 2 things are showing no signs of happening. Well, joining me now is Evelyn Farkas, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. We appreciate it. Do you think there's more that the international community could do to apply pressure?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, we need to be engaged, we meaning the international community, more actively in diplomacy in trying to essentially engineer a transition, much as we did in Ukraine. Now, we know ultimately the Ukrainian transition didn't work because the leader who had been discredited and basically forced by by his people from his position, lost his nerve and fled to Russia. But before that happened, the European Union, the United States, and even Russia brokered a transition for the Ukrainians so that they could go to elections. In the case of Belarus, they did just hold elections, so that's not the issue. The issue is whether the elections are going to be recognized, the election outcome, by the opposition. They were largely discredited by eyewitnesses who saw the ballots and understood that the victor was actually not Lukashenko. So we need to have the international community involved in trying to broker a transition, including the Russians. But if that doesn't work, certainly sanctions need to be a threat out there so that the government, so that the Belarusian armed forces and the Russians maintain an observance or do better when it comes to human rights. They're obviously violating human rights of Belarusians left, right, and center.
But surely to push for fundamental change in a country, you have to be confident that that country can take that opportunity and create something long-term, create something solid. And history is littered with examples, Libya and Iraq being two high-profile ones recently, that even when the West does push for change and support change, what follows is not necessarily what the West wants.
Well, first of all, in this case, the West was not pushing for a change in the government or a change of the regime. I mean, this was something that the Belarusian people decided amongst themselves. They wanted a change, and enough of them voted for Tikhonovskaya. So that is a reality that has nothing to do with the West. However, we want to protect the freedom of these people, the Belarusians, to pick their form of government, and freedom for them to not be abused, not have their human rights violated by their government. That's where the international community has an interest. Of course, we don't want bloodshed. And so in terms of what the viability is of a democracy in Belarus, that's up to the Belarusian people. Certainly, if they want help from the West, they can ask for it. The opposition leadership has been very clear that they are not looking to necessarily align with the West. They just want to be able to determine their own future and pick their own leaders. And they did not want Alexander Lukashenko anymore.
Evelyn Farkas, we appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much. And Evelyn was live with us from Washington.